Now, I like a good cheeseburger. To avoid throwing hands in the comments, I'm not going to say who does it best. If I let someone try one in hopes they can enjoy my taste, what if they disagree? They take a bite, give a stank face, and decide that it's not for them. And it's just for me to enjoy. Okay, do I consider them burger-phobic? Clearly, they're not afraid. So maybe anti-burger. But is it really that deep? Do I go that far? Do I fall down the crevices of social paranoia with distorted cognitions and assume they like me less due to this new notable difference between us? Because I perceive this answer as some kind of rejection. Or do I go full travel, make grand inferences about their character and cast them out because my personal preference somehow makes me more right? Of course not. That'd be weird. But replace cheeseburger with politics, gender norms, family values, cultural traditions, or nationalism, suddenly the same exact human dynamic gets weaponized in public debate. Disagreement stops being a simple preference or boundary and becomes phobic. Labels land like gavels. Conversation over. As you have been judged defective, not different. Welcome to the rabbit hole of social discourse. I don't plan to overcomplicate this. I think it's all rather simple. But it is interesting what plays into this. Classic case of institutional capture, whose interests become what you should think or feel. Join me as we navigate one of the most polarizing narratives to date, how core emotions and traits are being weaponized, the institutional tilt that caused it, and my personal opinion. We'll objectively define and explore the critical terms we plan to use that are at the root of these conflicts before branching out. Fear and disgust. As we know, fear is to be scared, shocked, surprised, startled. It's a survival mechanism. It's a full instinctual body response to threatening stimuli. It induces an anxious high-level stress response that changes our physical and cognitive selves, while even affecting our brain plasticity depending on severity and frequency. Anxiety is the high level of arousal and cognitive alertness raised by your sympathetic nervous system, while stress is measured by the physiological response, priming your body for action. How fear happens is rather specific, and it's one of the most tractable responses in neuroscience. It splits into two phases: the rapid threat reflex and the slower threat response. The amygdala acts as our neural hub of fear. It detects danger through our senses or by context before pinging the hypothalamus. It travels down to the brainstem nuclei before coordinating our freeze, fight, or flight behaviors, seizing the prefrontal cortex for impulsive reaction. Although fear can vary, most will feel it in this way. What makes human fear unique and prone to dysfunction is its interplay with social, cultural, and personality factors. We all share the basic threat reflex: rational fears, startled responses, unease around the unknown. These are adaptive. It's only a problem when fear becomes maladaptive, overwhelming normal function and causing prolonged emotional pain instead of priming effective action that we're familiar with. These are often separated into phobic and trauma responses. Unlike everyday common fears, phobias are intense, irrational fears of specific stimuli that hijack the nervous system to the point of dysfunction, even when the threat is minimal or non-existent. Trauma naturally differs. It's event-driven and less stimulus-specific, often reshaping our ability to gauge threats, memory, and handle emotions. Trauma can cause related phobias, but phobias don't typically cause widespread trauma disorders. These responses are based on personal thresholds, which are often tied to trait neuroticism, like a fear sensitivity, which we'll get into later. Disgust, however, is a behavioral and biological immune system response, an instinctive bodily and emotional rejection of contaminants. It goes far beyond just physical threats of basic or core disgust like rotten food, bodily fluids, or pathogens, to include in humans moral violations like breaking rules, betrayal, murder, perhaps. For survival to be continued, evolution shaped disgust as a highly sensitive defense against disease or what's not good for our health. By prompting avoidance of potential contaminants, it has promoted hygiene, cleanliness, and survival across species for thousands of years. In humans, this sensitivity extends to social and moral domains, helping maintain group norms and rules and purity standards that reduce exposure to threats, physical or ideological. The response starts visibly, a reflexive facial wrinkling, even in babies. Neurologically, it operates on a different circuit, the insular cortex, which handles interoception and social perception. From there, signals diverge a bit. Core disgust tends to show more left hemisphere activity, while more complex moral disgust often engages right hemisphere regions. Though activation can vary slightly. Unlike fear, which ramps up sympathetic arousal for fight or flight, disgust activates the parasympathetic nervous system, reducing appetite and arousal, stirring rejection or avoidance, gag reflexes, and whatnot. The amygdala provides quick threat appraisal, similar to fear, but the message is different. This isn't good. Put it down, or spit it out. These pathways prime withdrawal behaviors, reducing desires of interest. The unique implications we see in humans are rather grand. As cleanliness, ideations of pure versus impure take root. The building block of group cohesion as shame and guilt become subconscious levers. Disgust has a threshold, measured by disgust sensitivity or how quickly and severe you might feel disgust towards something. It's largely correlated with stability, categorical structure, how things should be, another human trait we'll get into. It's in a similar sense that should food spoil, becoming something it should not smell or look like, to our senses, it becomes something it's not supposed to be, inciting disgust. I use that wording to imply the suggestions of moral disgust, as it becomes a rather common rejection response when belief systems or social norms clash. The adaptiveness of these responses can be linked to the severity of tribalism or social attitudes. An example can be, murder is wrong, unless it's my enemy. So let's make it clear. Fear and disgust are evolved adaptive responses that have led to the continuum of survival. However, they don't share much of the same neural pathways, have different neural hubs, and even have different traits that influence the sensitivity of their responses. Additionally, fear is less instinctual than disgust, implying fear is easier to desensitize or overcome. Of course, there are nuances in edge cases. In clinical settings, extreme disgust can tip into OCD, where purity obsessions become life-disrupting. PTSD can have disgust-related triggers. Germaphobes and hemophobia, fear of blood, can exist. For the sake of the argument, we'll add it together, and that is only about 4% of the general population. It really isn't that common despite media portrayal. These are rather extremely unique and can be considered an exception to the rule. The distortion usually comes from modern discourse, through therapy speak, and self-diagnosed labels. All of a sudden, everyone's a clinical psychologist. But that doesn't change the pathological landscape. More people calling themselves or each other X doesn't change the statistics because the truth is, it was never a real diagnosis. It was just trendy, self-excusatory, or virtue signaling. Look, if we broke this down further, we'd find more differences, not less. I'm just trying to avoid an hour-long biology video. Without context, if you were to ask someone, what's fear or what's disgust, you might get much to the same answer, albeit far less detailed, but it is something we usually understand. So, what's up with all these wild narratives? To understand that, we need to first trace it to the measurable feature that predicts its necessity: personality. The Big Five personality model gives us a good framework for understanding why people default to one emotion over the other when facing disagreement. Neuroticism amplifies threat perception, more anxiety, more frequent fear spirals with greater tendency to interpret ambiguity as danger. It can create very anxious and erratic personalities, overly cautious and elicit very impulsive reactions to threatening ideations due to emotional irregularity derived from low fear thresholds. Conscientiousness, particularly the orderliness facet, heightens disgust sensitivity, stronger aversion to disorder, impurity, moral sloppiness, or boundary-crossing behaviors. Studies by various experts highlight how this predicts a preference for structured lives and traditional values, acting as a multifaceted protector against disorder. It's why someone might obsess over a tidy home or feel uneasy about societal changes that seem to erode clear rules. Cross-cultural meta-analyses show pretty reliable sex differences. Women tend to score higher on neuroticism, agreeableness, and a facet of conscientiousness, mainly orderliness, which is often found in their selective quality, social networks, the home, and personal environments. Men are higher in overall conscientiousness, higher on assertiveness and dominance, trailing towards higher disagreeableness or less fear of confrontation. Politically, as that seems to be the root of modern discourse, the patterns align. Higher neuroticism combined with openness predicts left-leaning, while higher conscientiousness and orderliness predict right-leanings. These differences aren't small. Correlations are naturally smaller in the social sciences, so these are massive by comparison of data. This can cause a split of perspective between men and women. But wait, if women are more orderly, why aren't more women conservative? Well, that's because of how that trait is altered by their higher forms of agreeableness, softening disgust responses. The influence of modern feminism seems to play a role as well. At the end of the day, neither is more right. For an example, a neurotic person might avoid social events out of fear or nervousness, while a conscientious one might steer clear due to disgust at improper behavior. Both are valid, but misunderstanding them as broken is frankly stupid and misses the point. So let's dive a little deeper into why these differences become a problem. Research from classic liberal Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory shows how these emotions fuel our moral intuitions through differing foundations. Within this theory, fear often aligns with concerns about harm and fairness, which liberals tend to empathize through empathy and protection. Disgust connects to purity, sanctity, and loyalty, foundations that conservatives prioritize more. Unfortunately, these natural variations in human wiring began to be painted as flaws, red flags in today's polarized discourse, with how these misunderstandings spill over into politics. Conservatives react more to disgust triggers, like perceived moral decay or rapid cultural shifts, seeing them as threats to order and sanctity, which explains the emphasis on tradition, authority, and purity. Hyde's work shows conservatives balance all moral foundations more evenly, with purity standing out. Liberals, by contrast, focus on the care, harm, and fairness equality dynamic, sometimes viewing disgust-based views as rigid or outdated. Both draw from real emotional roots, but it leads to messy clashes. Conservatives might push back against social changes, feeling like it muddies tradition, while liberals see those reactions as barriers to empathy. This causes a divide. Fear policies might ignore stability. Disgust policies alienate empathy seekers. Symbolically, disgust isn't just a yuck response. It's a boundary guardian, explaining conservatives' resistance to change. Ignoring this breeds conflict, turning valid intuitions into battle lines. But it wasn't always this bad. To say where this shift of finger-pointing began is more about waves than obvious timelines, but it's safe to say it was ideological and demographic. Ideologically, it was the social constructionists around the 1960s who developed the theories of gender as an opposition to valid evidence of certain psychological findings, the grand differences between men and women. So in order to contend with these differences, gender was created as a construct to reinforce this argument that could be separate from sex. It wasn't valid or proven for that matter, but it influenced the rise of a new ethos, the premise of creating cautious claims, insinuating that the sciences now have to prioritize care and inclusivity. Even today, these theorists still only have theoretical models built on rather weak claims. Gender was an idea, built on an idea using extremes found in research, in opposition to rigorous scientific evidence that fueled significant categorical information about men and women. Or stereotypes, as pattern recognition of cultures and sex have become absurdly synonymous to racism or sexism due to conflict between empirical reality and progressive commitments. It doesn't help that the remaining clerics of gender theory treat opposing evidence that validly disproves gender as unproven theories themselves, refusing key proven scientific frameworks like evolutionary and developmental biology, genetics and behavioral genetics, while also denying evidence-based longitudinal outcomes. This represented the first feminine ideological tilt. The idea that agreeableness is virtuous was built on this premise, later becoming glorified, suggesting that a trait more common in women is equally valuable in comparison to men's higher rates of conscientiousness, a valid predictor of success. It drove a divide in psychology and would cause the shift of how boys and men were treated institutionally, which created some of the first ripples in society. It's something I'll circle back to, just let me land this plane first. Here's the thing. Most statistical foundations aren't political. They are statistical constructs, not social constructs. They are not up to personal interpretation or expression of social scientists. They are measures. They weren't developed with political intent. They were developed based on objective observation. Think of the time of their finding. People forget or lack the ability to place a historical lens onto their worldviews. It's why people poorly understand the Bible as a matter of context. Therefore, we can't infuse political understanding into something that has no political background or implications for some ulterior motive. That's weaponization. A gradual shift happened, due in large part to these theories. Rules and educational environments began adopting an emphasis on female temperament instead of both sexes. Therapy became less effective with men, as treatment and approaches began focusing and recording symptoms more common in the female experience, prioritizing feminine nature, with some models viewing masculinity through a feminine lens. Narratives formed more around agreeable dispositions. This led to more regulation of male spaces and the criticism on deferring behavior. Defined ideal male behavior became more popular, meaning men can have the responsibility to be men without the authority to be men. As an example of this kind of framing, a popular neuroscience study back in 2006 captures this. Men and women were connected to brain scans, tracking different responses as they observed two people playing a game. When men and women observed these people playing fairly, and when the players were painfully shocked, empathy centers lit up for both men and women. When they observed the player cheating and then being shocked, women's empathy centers lit up the same as before, whereas men's reward circuit lit up instead. This study concluded that men have an empathy deficit, and it was labeled as men's revenge pleasure, how men have a deep-seated desire to punish others. It implies the empathy response is always the better response. But is it? Let's think about that. When a criminal goes to jail, is that revenge or is that consequence? Do we start painting consequence as something that shouldn't happen? Are the judges pleasuring themselves with this idea? The true implications were that empathy can impede moral judgment, or perhaps women are less effective authority figures on average. The point is, we no longer follow stoic or masculine ethos, in which we no longer have a society based on the father. Our institutions have been feminized. And that's not a stretch. If you don't believe me, there's actually this great video called The Feminization of Academia, noting the alarms of these shifts. I highly recommend you check it out. Historical narratives of patriarchal oppression are outdated, as those issues no longer exist. And acknowledging those changes is inconvenient to those narratives. This isn't the 1900s, so how long until we call this for what it is? Will it ever be enough? I don't think so. And here's where it gets a bit frustrating. Terms like homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, whatever the fuck phobia never had any validity as actual clinical labels. But over the past 4 decades, they've been morphed into moral weapons, especially in progressive circles. If someone with opposing views voices discomfort, perhaps rooted in disgust, it's slapped with a phobia tag, framing it as a defect rather than a value difference. A bit unfair and inaccurate. A while back, critics pointed out this political shift, clinical terms being politicized to paint disagreement as hatred, conveniently blurring prejudice and moral differences, assuming hatred instead of boundaries. It's like calling someone who cares about hygiene germphobic and bigoted. It skips context and kills conversation. Perhaps that's the intent, as good faith interactions seem to be less common when dogmatic reactions are involved. This tactic thrives in social discourse, turning valid views into pathology, while ironically enforcing its own purity code. It suppresses dialogue and demands conformity of the impure. Edge cases like transgender debates show this pretty well. Disgust-based boundary concerns get recast as a bigoted attitude or anti-trans, as if one point of view is more human than the other. Which it isn't about existence or compassion, it's about sex being a mutable trait or a protected category with actual consequences, like sports, prisons, or youth medicalization. Don't get me wrong, progressive empathy has driven genuine advances, civil rights, public health, reduced stigma. The error is when empathy becomes boundary blindness, almost suicidal, and labels in its rabid defense fall into pathology. This dynamic is supercharged in academia, especially social sciences, where the framing of these narratives, personality differences, and labels are being weaponized via new shaky psych interpretations to deem conservative values bad or unnatural. This is all highly associated with the second variable, demographic changes. Now, men still dominate certain STEM fields like computer sciences, math, and engineering. However, women are overrepresented in full-time faculty spots overall, with snapshots showing this is about 50% in 2026, even more so in fields like psychology or sociology, while rising to 77% in K-12 public schools. Quite different than the 27% found about 40 years ago in 1987. Meta-analyses have constantly displayed women's natural leaning towards progressiveness and agreeable, more neurotic personalities than men cross-culturally. So what did we think an overabundance of compassion and threat sensitivity was going to accomplish in the realm of psychology as an example? Empathy can negatively impact the objective sciences and view various outcomes of studies as discriminatory or mean. We saw a shift of who can be studied and how. It willfully ignores cultural differences and turns it into an inclusive narrative of all cultures are equally valuable, whereas more stoic traits make it more likely to confront these differences rather than avoid them. Applied to a large scale, conservative morals get reframed as neurotic, emotional issues needing fixing, with more objective consequences in different spaces, like getting blacklisted from collegiate opportunities or sponsorship. This isn't open science, it's selective use of data for conformity. It's not just about gender, but a broader neurotic feminine tilt. A tilt that has been happening for decades, commandeering narratives, and we haven't really discussed the damage of it in open forum because arguing the point of this shift isn't relevant to progressive slogans. Naturally, this concocted convenient use of labels enters societal debate from the narrative capture occurring in these environments. It furthered tribalism by discrediting valid opposing views, projecting neurotic framing that encompasses their political reality on what was often just deferring values influenced by personality. It turns these institutions into indoctrination centers, backwards pluralism, ideological bias as progress, and pseudoscience ignoring conscientious benefits like societal stability. It's this kind of ideological split that pushes ethnicity or gender over nationalism, allowing the identity of a country or its sovereignty to fall apart. We are drifting from a culture of values to a culture of identity. It's conveniently divisive to celebrate difference. and not what can bring us all to the table. And it's selective. Western society specifically, as cultures that fall outside of this view need to be protected in some way as if that culture hasn't already existed for over a millennium. Unfortunately, arriving to these conclusions implies misogyny in today's sensitive political climate. This doesn't imply that women are the problem. It implies the likelihood of similar personality clusters compiling into an environment will shift the landscape, leading to various data differences getting framed as moral defect rather than evidence. When men dominated faculty in the 1950s, the institutional tilt was towards risk-tolerant, low-agreeableness inquiry that produced plenty of its own blind spots. The point is balance, not supremacy. Overrepresentation of any personality profile, neurotic or stoic, creates echo chambers. Today's profile simply weaponizes empathy language against orderliness language, rewarding high neuroticism, high agreeableness, and empathy-sensitive reasoning, naturally attracting more women on average. Too much of something will cause an inevitable tilt, and what we're seeing is the opposite effect. So what's worse? I partially think that the best progressive ideology had to offer is behind us, for now. I think now we need to regain balance. And this is my opinion because it's not so black and white. We've unfortunately reached a point in these essential traits where one is comforted or glorified, while the other is branded a defect, despite disgust historically being the foundation of our social immune system. Personally, I think there's an existential problem. It's also here where maternal instinct becomes somewhat central to the whole story with respect to demographic changes. Women have always had this powerful, caretaking drive, that evolved impulse to nurture, protect, and maintain the purity of their immediate circle. It mainly expressed itself in their own family, children, and close community. Today, for a growing number of women in the feminine-coded institutions they now dominate, that maternal response has been inverted. That energy redirected outward towards other people's families through certain jobs. Abstract activism, distant perpetual victims, and outsiders. Today, it's the Palestinians or illegal immigrants, but we've seen this before. Did nothing matter enough until they got to that scale? Perhaps due to personal relational failure, like poor experiences with human connection, or modern feminism. It allowed the more intimate boundaries of home, family, cultural traditions, and national community to become quietly pathologized as selfish, bigoted, or phobic. The positive feminine identity has all but been torn apart in mainstream media. Being fulfilled traditionally induces backlash from the progressive crowd. We've seen it. How dare you have kids? You're a pick-me. What's it like being a slave to a man? This isn't an attack on women, it's an observation about what happens when a powerful biological and emotional system loses its natural outlet. It's an influx of identity crisis because we dismantled the home and the pillars that maintained it. When this response that once protected immediate relationships is slowly reframed as hatred or phobic, that maternal instinct doesn't disappear. It simply finds new targets. It begins protecting ideological purity instead of familial or communal purity. It pours energy into safeguarding strangers on the other side of the world while treating disagreement from neighbors or even children as a contaminant that must be rejected or fixed. That's the deeper tragedy hidden inside the from boundaries to bigotry narrative. By labeling normal disgust and boundary setting as pathological, we don't just suppress an emotion. We distort one of the strongest human drives for care and protection. The very impulse that once built stable families and cohesive societies is now being channeled into activism that often weakens those same structures. The result is a society full of caretakers who feel deeply for everyone except the people and traditions closest to them. This inversion explains a lot of what we see. The surge in homeschooling as parents reclaim the right to set boundaries around their children's development. The discomfort many feel when cultural or sexual norms are treated as suddenly morally gray. And the growing sense that empathy without limits has become a form of self-erasure. It never ends because it allows avoidance of self and self-prerogative. People often find it easier to help distant beings than to wrestle with the hardship of intimate and genuine relationships and real boundaries. There's far more risk. It's not always benevolent compassion driving this activism. Sometimes it's self-unacceptance, self-deprecation, or the search for belonging through perpetual victimhood. Like, what are we doing? It's no wonder we see media outlets capitalizing on these temperaments by using fear-mongering as a narrative tool for exaggerated threat response, pushing the focus on perpetuated crisis. Dumb shit like no King's rally and fascist protests. Yeah, right. You know there's a problem when you gotta pay people to show up. In peripheral view of all this, there's this contradicting behavior of safetyism, among many modern progressives, fiercely conservative of their beliefs, but not toward the communities, families, or countries that actually sustain them. A good man once said, when people stop talking, that's when you get violence. That's when civil war happens, because you start to think the other side is so evil that they lose their humanity. They don't see fellow Americans, fellow human beings with different opinions. They see enemies. It's been completely overwritten until all they are is the idea they've conformed to, becoming captured and static. So why have empathy for your enemies? Well, I don't know. Maybe because that's what separates us from the animals. And you're nothing but impulse if you blindly believe that. Like, where's your critical thinking? We're neighbors, not enemies, not warring factions. There's a quote by Carl Jung. People don't have ideas. Ideas have people. And that's something we need to be aware of, because what you know will never be as important as what you have yet to learn. Right. But you forgo this by limiting yourself to the persona the idea demands instead of the you that's neglected underneath. It's so stupid. These academic totalitarian types thinking there's only one path to politics or moral structure. It really contradicts the inherent openness liberalism was predicated on. Intellectuals, to me, would have a larger group of opinions than a say the thing hive mind culture that seems to have taken place. There's this vapid space of intellectual authority that is absent of morals and wisdom, and it demands authority without responsibility. No, you are not more right because you feel strongly. You just feel strongly. Sort that shit out. There's more and more people who don't want to be a part of this perverse form of progressivism that has lost its way. This intergroup rivalry, this who's more virtuous or oppressed game. Check it out. Disagreement is not hatred. Preference is not phobia. Caring deeply for your own circle is not bigotry. It is the healthy expression of the very instincts that made stable societies possible in the first place. If we keep pathologizing half of the personality spectrum, who exactly is left to maintain the order and structure that let the empathetic thrive in the first place? Societies that forget how to say, this is ours and we get to protect it, eventually lose the ability to protect anything at all, including the empathy they claim to champion. Believe it or not, we can disagree. My not agreeing with your values doesn't make me phobic or anti-you. It doesn't erase your humanity or mine. Having differing values doesn't make us enemies. I won't be forced into your side of the Venn diagram, and you shouldn't need my full acceptance to feel secure. You can't get upset when people dislike you for this kind of behavior, and you can't hide behind your identity as if that's what's causing it. You are. Immaturity is a hat that all can wear. Women, men, gay, trans, left, right, any race. Stop the parasocial assumptions that turn strangers to enemies. Stop listening with the intent to win. Start listening with the intent to understand. It's crazy. The brainwashing is crazy, but I get it. It's a bit redundant. It's like beating a dead horse. So why talk about it? Well, believe it or not, there's a war on meaning. And it started with subtle changes in literature until now the fruits of that wicked labor is smacking us in the face with societal conflict and ideological polarity. It should matter. We have to remember to stay grounded in something a little more than just our feelings. I think a great question for people that seem to be wrestling with this is, what level of avoidance are you engaging with? Asking if you are isn't the right question. Everybody is. So to what extent are you? I think that answer might explain a lot on a personal level, because you often find yourself in the place you least want to look. Appreciate y'all for watching. I've been working on chopping my videos down a little more. Let me know what you think. But more importantly, hit me in the comments. Let me know your thoughts on these narratives and our current direction. Just be respectful. We're all American, or at least all human. Seems like that's kind of lost on people lately. I want to bring that back. So thanks again, and I'll go ahead and see you next time.